The dust never quite settles in Coyote Bend. Out past the edge of town, where the wind cuts sharper than a knife and the fences lean tired against the land, lives a man named Silas Hart. Folks don't talk much about Silas, they just nod if he rides by. A widowed cowboy with more ghosts than neighbors, Silas minds his ranch and keeps to himself. That is, until the sheriff rode in with a piece of paper and a crooked smile. They said his land wasn't his, claimed the dirt under his boots belonged to the county now. Silas didn't shout, didn't curse, but something in his eyes turned hard as dry stone. Then the fires started, fences slashed, his barn in ashes, and behind it all, a cattle boss with too much money and a sheriff with too little spine. But Silas ain't just grit and silence. He's got something they don't, the truth, and a map that might just burn their whole scheme to the ground. So saddle up, partner. This ain't just a story about land. It's about justice without a badge, about how one quiet man stood taller than the law when the law forgot what it was for. If you believe the West still holds room for honor, hit that subscribe button and share this with someone who carries cowboy in their soul. The wind over Coyote Bend carried grit and memory. It tugged at fence posts, rattled the dry mesquite, and whistled through the cracks in Silas Hart's porch rail. The ranch was quiet that morning. Too quiet. His mare, Lucy, didn't whinny when she saw him coming from the barn. The rooster hadn't crowed. And the coffee, though fresh on the stove, tasted like dust. Silas stood on the porch, mug in hand, gaze fixed on the eastern ridge. That was his land, at least it had been for near 15 years. He and Mary had carved it from nothing but rock and thorn, made it a place worth calling home. Even after she passed 5 winters ago, he kept her name on the mailbox and her roses growing by the kitchen window. He heard the hoofbeats before he saw them. Slow, deliberate. Sheriff Claude Mercer wasn't the type to rush, especially not when trouble was on his side. The sheriff wore his uniform like armor, buttons too shiny for a dusty town, his mustache trimmed to perfection, like a man with something to prove and time to waste. He didn't dismount, just pulled a yellowed envelope from his saddlebag and tossed it toward Silas's boots. "Morning, Hart," Mercer drawled. "Hate to be the bearer of bad news, but I got orders from the county. That land you're squatting on? It's public now. Goes up for auction end of the month." Silas didn't move. His eyes didn't flinch. He just stared, calm as ever, like the ground beneath him wouldn't dare shift. "You're mistaken," he said finally, voice low and steady. "This land's deeded to Mary and me. She signed it herself. Judge Hendry put his name on it." Mercer smirked. "Then you best dig that up, cowboy, 'cause the record at the county office says otherwise. No deed on file, no plat map, nothing but dust." Silas bent slowly, picked up the envelope. Inside was a single page with the county seal. "Notice of public reclamation," it read. "Parcel 147B, Hart Ranch. Effective in 30 days. He let the paper fold back on itself like a snake curling in dry grass. "This a favor to someone, Mercer?" Silas asked. "Or just your own mean streak showing?" The sheriff leaned forward in his saddle, spurs jingling as he shifted. "You ever hear of a cattleman named Hank Dobbins?" "I've heard worse names." "He made a generous offer to help improve our trail routes, build a new schoolhouse, bring jobs to this town, and your property's smack in the middle of the expansion. So you're burying the man who kept it alive." Mercer shrugged. "Progress don't stop for sentiment, Silas. You got 30 days, or you'll be trespassing." Silas watched him turn his horse around, the hooves crunching the dry earth as Mercer rode back down the dusty path. The sheriff didn't look back. He didn't need to. Inside the cabin, Silas knelt beside an old cedar trunk. The iron latch creaked as he opened it. Beneath Mary's quilt and a few yellowing photographs lay a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. He unrolled it gently. There, in Mary's handwriting, faint but steady, was the deed. Dated, signed, and sealed. He held it in his hands for a long moment, heart slow but pounding. Someone had gone to a lot of trouble to erase that document from the records. Trouble meant intention, and intention meant a fight coming, whether Silas wanted one or not. He saddled Lucy just after noon, hitched his coat tight, tucked the deed into a leather folio, and rode out toward the county records office. The road wound through brittle scrub, past abandoned wagons and sun-baked fence posts. Every hoofbeat echoed a little louder than it should have. By the time he arrived, the sun was high, casting long shadows off the red brick building. The clerk inside looked nervous before Silas even spoke. "I'm looking for the file on parcel 147B, he said. "Hart Ranch. Need to see the deed record." The clerk swallowed hard, cheeks pale. "I'm sorry, Mr. Hart. That file was pulled last week. No idea who by. It's gone." Silas didn't say a word, just turned and walked out, boots striking the tiled floor like a warning bell. The West had a way of forgetting good men, but Silas Hart wasn't one to go quietly. As he rode away from town, the wind shifted, and in it, Silas swore he heard Mary's voice whisper, "Don't let them take what we bled for." The scent of ash hit before Silas saw the smoke. He'd been riding back from the county office under a sky cracked with heat, the kind that made every mile feel like 5. But as he crested the hill above the ranch, a dark column curled toward the heavens, slow, deliberate, like it had nowhere else to be. His breath caught. By the time he reached the yard, the barn was little more than a blackened skeleton. Flames had already eaten through the roof. The north wall had collapsed inward, and the rest was wheezing its last. Silas jumped from Lucy's saddle, boots landing in scorched dirt. He grabbed the old water pump and doused what embers he could, but it was a useless effort. The fire had done its damage. The cattle were safe. They'd been grazing up near the ravine. But the tack room was gone. His hay for winter, too. And more than that, the place held Mary's saddle, her old quilted horse blanket, the one with the blue stitching she made by hand during the first snow after they married. Gone. He stood there in the settling smoke, not moving, just listening to the fire crackle and spit as it died on its own terms. That evening, as the light bled out of the sky, Silas walked the fence line. It didn't take long to find the cuts, 3 in total. Clean, deliberate slices through the wire, as if made by a knife, not weather or wear. A few posts had been yanked loose too, then jammed back in sloppy-like. The message was clear. Somebody wanted him scared. Silas knelt beside the broken wire, touched the frayed metal with his calloused fingers. Whoever had done it had known where to hurt him, quietly, without leaving prints the sheriff might care about. Not that Mercer would have lifted a finger anyhow. Back at the cabin, he poured himself a cup of stale coffee, hands steady but cold. He sat on the porch steps, staring into the dark. Somewhere beyond the brush, a coyote called out long and lonesome. "You know," a voice slurred from the shadows, "they used to call this place Hart's Line." Silas didn't flinch. "Evening, Thatch." The man stumbled into the moonlight, his frame slight, shirt stained with something brown and unmentionable. Thatch Crenshaw had once worked as a railroad surveyor, back when the tracks first crawled through Coyote Bend. Now he was mostly known for his smell and his tall tales. Thatch dropped onto the step beside him without asking. "Saw the smoke from town," he said, taking a swig from a dented flask. "Shame about the barn. Shame about a lot of things." Silas gave a slow nod. "You here to drink or talk?" Thatch grinned, yellow teeth catching the moonlight. "Maybe both." They sat in silence for a bit, passing the flask back and forth. It tasted like kerosene and regret. "You ever check what's buried under your well?" Thatch asked suddenly. Silas turned to him, brow furrowed. "What are you rambling about?" "Back when I surveyed this place, years ago, before you and Mary even thought about building, there was a marker stone, right by where you dug that well, landline corner. Real old. Not on the new maps they're pushing now." Silas's jaw tightened. "You sure?" "Sure as I am that Mercer ain't clean." Thatch wiped his mouth with the back of his sleeve. "They moved the lines, Silas. Shifted 'em by just enough to steal without asking. But you find that stone, you find the truth." Silas leaned forward, heart slow but heavy. If what Thatch said was true, then maybe, just maybe, the land grab wasn't just about him. Maybe others had been pushed out. And maybe, somewhere under dust and root, the truth still waited. "I'll dig at first light," Silas said. Thatch nodded, rising to his feet. "You do that, cowboy, and when you find it, don't keep quiet." As the old man shuffled into the night, Silas sat still beneath a sky smudged with stars. His barn was gone, his fence cut, but something deeper had sparked in his chest. Not anger, not yet, but purpose. As the last cinder died, Silas whispered to the dark, "Mary, I ain't letting them bury what's ours." And the wind, just faintly, carried back a promise of something hidden beneath the soil. Dawn crept slow over Coyote Bend, smearing the hills in pale gold. Silas was already up, shovel in hand, boots crunching through the dew-soaked grass behind the cabin. He hadn't slept much, not after what Thatch said the night before. His back ached, his barn was ash, and the air still smelled faintly of smoke. But none of that mattered now. If there was a cornerstone buried beneath the well, it might be the one thing that proved this land had always been his. He started at the western edge of the well, the spot Mary had once marked with a wooden post, now long rotted to nothing. The soil was dry on top, but a few inches down it turned dense and stubborn. He worked in silence, stopping only to wipe sweat from his brow. By mid-morning, he hit stone. Not just any stone. This one was flat, square, and carved with markings near the edges. He knelt beside it, brushing away the dirt. His fingers traced the letters worn smooth by time. CB 1871. His heart jumped. Coyote Bend, 1871, he whispered. The land patent date, older than any recent claim. He sat back on his heels, the weight of it all pressing against his chest. This marker hadn't just been left, it had been buried, deliberately. Someone had tried to erase it. And not just him. If the new county survey lines were covering land that already had historical claims, how many other ranchers had been driven out with the same lie? That evening, Silas rode back into town, the marker's dimensions copied carefully in his ledger book. He found Thatch in the back corner of the saloon, drinking rye from a chipped tin cup, same as always. "You were right," Silas said, setting the book down in front of him. Thatch blinked at the sketch. "Well, I'll be still there, huh?" "Buried, deep." Silas leaned in. "I need a copy of the original plat map, the one they used back in the railroad days. You still got access?" Thatch scratched at his beard. "Might know where to find one. There's a box of old ledgers in the county surveyor's shack, behind the dry goods store. Been abandoned since the new boys took over." "I need that map," Silas said, voice low. "I can't fight him with just a rock and a story." Thatch stared at him for a long moment, then gave a slow nod. "You got grit, Hart. I'll see what I can dig up." 2 nights later, Thatch returned, this time sober or close enough. He laid a folded, brittle sheet on Silas's kitchen table. The edges crackled like dry leaves. "Here," he said. "Coyote Bend region. Surveyed 1870. Your parcel's right there, lot 22. And take a look at this." He pointed at a thick borderline that ran straight through half a dozen other homesteads. These weren't public lands. These were settler parcels. Pre-Homestead Act. Silas stared at it. "So how'd they vanish from the county record?" Thatch smirked, bitter as coffee grounds. "Same way your file disappeared. Somebody with a badge and a friend named Dobbins." Silas ran his hand over the faded ink. His wife's name echoed in his ears. She had always believed this land was a promise worth keeping. Now it was more than that. It was a lie worth unraveling. "I'm taking this to the Jubilee," he said. Thatch raised a brow. "Harvest Jubilee? You planning to call out Mercer and Dobbins in front of half the county?" "That's exactly what I'm planning." Thatch whistled. "Well, I reckon that'll make the fireworks look tame." Silas packed the map, his wife's deed, and the ledger into his saddlebag. The Jubilee was 2 days away, a big town affair, full of speeches, smiles, and half-truths baked into pie contests and cattle shows. But Silas Hart had no interest in the festivities. He was riding in with facts. As he saddled Lucy under the rising sun, he tightened the worn leather strap around his satchel and murmured, "You picked the wrong cowboy to bury." The road to the Jubilee had never looked so full of reckoning. Coyote Bend dressed itself up once a year for the Harvest Jubilee. Bunting stretched across Main Street. Kids chased each other with corn husk dolls. The scent of fresh pies mingled with hay and horses and sweat. It was the kind of celebration built to make folks forget about hard winters and empty granaries, at least for a day. Silas Hart rode in just after noon, his coat dusty, saddle creaking beneath him. He didn't shave, didn't bother to iron his shirt. Let him call him the outsider. He wasn't here to win any ribbon or smile for the mayor. He He was here to raise hell, the quiet, pointed kind that leaves a scar. The square was packed. Up by the gazebo, Mayor Whitby was beaming as he shook hands with Hank Dobbins, who stood tall in his gleaming boots, silver spurs catching the sun like they belonged in a parade. His new cattle trail, barely a week old, was the talk of the Jubilee. It had cut across half a dozen plots on the outskirts, including what used to be the Hart Ranch. "Folks," the mayor bellowed, "let's give thanks to the man who's bringing prosperity back to our little corner of the West. Mr. Dobbins has pledged funds for a new schoolhouse, a grain silo, and road repairs, all at no cost to taxpayers." The crowd clapped, not wildly, not warmly, but polite enough to keep standing. Silas waited until the final cheer died. "Question is," he said, loud and firm from the crowd, "whose land did he pave it all through?" Heads turned. Dobbins glanced down from the gazebo, face stiffening. "Well now," he called, "if it ain't Mr. Hart, thought you'd have moved on by now." "I would have," Silas said, stepping into the center, "if this wasn't still my land." Mayor Whitby cleared his throat. "Let's keep this civil, gentlemen. This is a family event." "It sure is," Silas cut in. "Shame some of those families don't know the county's been selling off their birthright." A hush swept the square like wind through wheat. Silas reached into his coat and pulled out the folded survey map, holding it up for all to see. "This here is the original plat map for Coyote Bend, dated 1870. Shows my homestead, Lot 22, as legally deeded and surveyed. There's a cornerstone buried beside my well to prove it, and I reckon a few others here remember their kin setting stakes on land that just up and vanished in the records." From the crowd, an old woman gasped. A man in suspenders muttered, "My uncle lost his parcel last year." Dobbins stepped forward, voice smooth as molasses. "Now hold on. This is all just dramatics. Anyone can wave a map around. The county made its adjustments fair and legal." "You sure about that?" Silas said, narrowing his eyes. "'Cause I've got documents, court records, registry entries, some signed by men who died protecting the land they built with bare hands." That's when a clerk from the church registry, a young woman in wire-rimmed glasses, tapped Silas's arm. "I saw your name on an old ledger," she whispered, slipping him a worn book from her satchel. "I thought it might help." Silas opened the book. His breath hitched. There it was, a signature from 1889, Judge Thaddeus Greeley, Mary's father. He turned the page gently. Below it, an addendum listing Lot 22 as protected land, granted under postbellum settlement provisions. Not just personal, legal. Silas looked up, eyes burning with quiet fire. "You still think I'm bluffing, Dobbins?" Dobbins didn't answer. He just smirked. Tight, controlled. The kind of smirk men wear when they're cornered but not ready to bite. Mayor Whitby coughed again. We'll look into the claim." "You do that," Silas said. "But know this, it ain't just me you'll be answering to." He turned and walked out of the square, the crowd parting like a tide. Behind him, whispers grew louder, and somewhere beneath the surface of this dusty little town, the truth began to tremble free. Back at his cabin, by lantern light, Silas stared at the judge's name and whispered, "Mary, your father just rode back from the grave." By the next morning, Silas Hart wasn't just a rancher with a fire-scorched barn and a missing deed. He was a man on a mission. The church registry page with Judge Greeley's signature now sat beside Mary's original deed, the plat map, and a fresh affidavit from Thatch, who'd scrawled out what he remembered about the cornerstone and the missing survey files. Silas had bound the pages tight in an old folio and tied it shut with saddle string. He'd never stepped foot inside a courthouse unless someone was getting married or buried. But that morning, he shaved, polished his boots, rode into the county seat with the quiet weight of a man carrying both evidence and grief. The clerk behind the tall desk blinked when Silas laid the folio down. "I'm here to file an injunction," Silas said calmly. "Parcel 147B, known as Hart Ranch. I'm asserting my legal claim, and I got the documents to back it." The clerk reached for the folder, uncertain. "You sure about this, Mr. Hart? Challenging the county's land reallocation?" "Never been sure of anything," Silas said. "And if you delay this filing, you'll be complicit in a theft. Might not sound like much to some, but that land is the only thing my wife left me." Something in his voice silenced the room. The clerk nodded and began stamping the pages. By the time Silas rode home, the sun was high, and the dust shimmered like heat ghosts on the trail. The cattle trail Dobbins carved through his land had already widened. Fresh ruts now cut deeper than before. Silas dismounted near the bend and stared at the new fence they'd hammered into his southern boundary. He untied Lucy's lead rope, secured it to a mesquite tree, and walked the trail with a wheelbarrow full of old fence posts, rusted horseshoes, and broken wagon wheels. It wasn't elegant, but by sundown the trail was blocked from both directions. Let them call it petty. He called it a line in the sand. He didn't go inside that night. He sat on the porch with a lantern and Mary's quilt across his knees, just listening. When the wind shifted, he swore he heard laughter. Low, mean. It came from down the slope near the cottonwood trees. Then came the crack of wood, not distant, not accidental. He grabbed his rifle and ran down the slope, lantern swinging. The damage was already done. His porch rail had been torn off, scattered like kindling. Boot prints, 3 sets, led back toward the trees. No cattle, no wagon, just men with enough time and spite to remind him they were watching. Silas didn't fire, didn't shout into the trees. He just breathed through his teeth and let the lantern glow faint beside the wreckage. The same men who came for his barn had now come for his home. But it wasn't fear in his chest this time. It was resolve. At dawn, as he cleared the debris, his foot hit something solid under the porch's edge. An old board he hadn't seen in years. He pried it loose, and there it was, a rusted strongbox wrapped in wax cloth. He carried it inside, set it gently on the table, and opened it like it might still carry a heartbeat. Inside were court documents, yellowed, stamped, and sealed. Old, but legible. Land case transcripts from the 1870s. One of them was addressed to Judge Thaddeus Greeley. And at the bottom, a folded note in Mary's handwriting. If they ever come for it, don't let them lie. This land is ours. M. Silas closed his eyes and pressed the note to his chest. They thought they could scare him off, burn him out, make him small. But they forgot one thing. He had history on his side. That night, as a thunderstorm rolled in from the west, Silas whispered into the dark, "Time to wake the judge." And the winds outside howled like justice finally stirring. Silas didn't hear the riders until they were nearly on him. He'd been in the shed behind the cabin, carefully wrapping Mary's court records and the old plat map in oilcloth when the pounding hooves tore through the stillness. By the time he stepped out into the yard, Sheriff Claude Mercer and 2 deputies were already dismounting. The sheriff didn't bother with pleasantries. "You're under arrest, Hart," he said, holding out a folded warrant. "Obstruction of county development, unlawful interference with public trail access, and defacement of commercial property." Silas stared at him, calm but cold. "All that for moving some rocks and fixing my fence?" Mercer's grin didn't reach his eyes. "It ain't the rocks, Hart. It's the noise you're making. County can't function with every settler crying foul 'cause you waved an old map around." "You read the judge's name on it?" "Doesn't matter." Mercer snapped his fingers. The deputies stepped in. Silas didn't resist. He handed over the papers to one of them and muttered, "Keep that dry." Then he locked the door to his cabin, as if he might still return. The jailhouse in Coyote Bend hadn't changed since the war. Iron bars, wood frame, and a single cot that creaked louder than the door. Silas was thrown into the corner cell. Mercer leaned against the opposite wall, chewing a toothpick like it was a badge of honor. "You should have sold," the sheriff said, watching him. "Dobbins made you a fair offer once." "Fair's got nothing to do with it," Silas replied. "That land ain't for sale. Never was." Mercer shrugged. "Now it's county property. Or it will be once this injunction gets tossed." But Silas didn't reply. He just laid back on the cot, folding his arms under his head. "Storm's coming," he said quietly. Mercer scoffed. "Weather's clear. Not that kind of storm." The sheriff slammed the door behind him. Hours passed. The jailhouse was mostly silent, save the occasional bark of a dog outside or the shuffle of boots across dusty floorboards. It wasn't until late afternoon that Silas heard the voice. "You the one they say's got the whole town asking questions?" Silas opened his eyes. A young deputy, couldn't be more than 20, stood at the bars, holding a tin mug of water. Hair unkempt, shirt untucked, and eyes full of something too rare in men that age. Hesitation. "Depends," Silas said, sitting up. "You got a name?" "Amos," the kid said, handing him the mug through the bars. "Amos Klein." Silas took a sip. "You related to Henry Klein? Owned the orchard by the river?" The young man nodded, then looked down. "Was. He lost it 3 years back. Claimed the paperwork vanished. Nobody listened." Silas nodded slowly. "I believe it. Same trick they tried with me." Amos shifted his weight. "I found something in the old files, tucked behind a livestock registration. It's a deposition. Some settler named Wilkins gave it years ago. Says Dobbins bribed surveyors to shift claim lines." Silas's pulse kicked up. "You still got it?" The deputy nodded. "Didn't show the sheriff?" "Smart boy," Silas said. "You take that to Judge Rayner in Fairhold. He's still got jurisdiction and a memory longer than Mercer's lies. Get it to him by Sunday." Amos hesitated. "That's 2 counties over." "I know," Silas said. "But if you get that document to Rayner, and the judge reopens my case, I'll see to it your uncle's land is looked at again, fair and legal." The young man studied him for a long moment. Then, with a quiet nod, he turned and walked out the door, tucking the papers into his coat like they were gold. Back in his cell, Silas laid back down and closed his eyes. Let them throw stones. Let them lie. He had passed the torch, and that was more dangerous than any rifle. The night air settled heavy as silence returned. But far off, the sound of hooves thundered eastward, carrying the truth on a path the sheriff couldn't block. The Fairhold courthouse hadn't seen a Sunday crowd like that since statehood. Folks from Coyote Bend and beyond gathered under a gray sky, drawn by whispers of corruption, land theft, and one cowboy who wouldn't back down. Inside the old brick building, the benches were filled, the air thick with dust and tension. Silas Hart stood tall in his cleanest shirt, boots polished, wrists still marked from the sheriff's cuffs. Beside him sat his folio, stuffed with every scrap of evidence he'd bled and burned for. Across the aisle, Sheriff Mercer fidgeted like a man sitting too close to a flame. Hank Dobbins hadn't shown yet, but that didn't surprise Silas. At the front of the room, Judge Rayner adjusted his spectacles and cleared his throat. "Mr. Hart," he said, voice slow but firm, "you've filed for re-examination of Parcel 147B, claiming unlawful seizure and fraudulent erasure of title records. I have reviewed the injunction and the supporting exhibits. Please proceed." Silas stepped forward, eyes scanning the crowd. He wasn't used to speeches, but this wasn't just his fight anymore. "Your Honor, this land's been mine and Mary's since 1871. My wife's father, Judge Greeley, signed the deed himself. We found the cornerstone buried by the well, still marked with the original patent date. That alone should hold weight." He paused, then pulled the surveyor's plat map from the folio and held it high. "This is the original map, shows Lot 22, Hart Ranch, on settler land. Not public, not up for auction. The map was hidden in the old surveyor shack, with witness notes from a man named Crenshaw, a railroad surveyor who's still alive and willing to testify." Judge Rayner raised a brow but said nothing. Silas laid out the church ledger next, flipping to the signature. "And here, a registry page from 1889 signed by Judge Greeley, my wife's father, confirming the church accepted the Hart homestead under lawful terms. That name ain't one to forge." Gasps murmured through the room. Silas didn't stop. "I was jailed last week. Sheriff Mercer said I was obstructing public work, but I think it's more likely I was obstructing him and Mr. Dobbins." He pulled out the final document, a sealed deposition. "This is the testimony of a settler named Wilkins, found by Deputy Amos Klein, who risked his job to bring it here. It details bribery, Dobbins paying surveyors to shift claim lines, erase deeds, and open up land for cattle expansion. If you match those adjusted parcels with recent acquisitions, you'll see a pattern, and it all points to one man." A quiet voice echoed from the rear. "That man just arrived." All heads turned as Hank Dobbins strode through the double doors, flanked by 2 men in suits. He looked rattled, but not defeated. Judge Rayner gestured to the deputy. "Escort Mr. Dobbins to the stand." Dobbins didn't sit. He stood tall, eyes narrowed at Silas. "I don't know what kind of theater this is," he said, "but I've done nothing illegal. The county processed those sales fair and square." Judge Rayner tapped the bench. "And yet, we have evidence of missing files, multiple testimonies, and a deposition that places you at the center of a bribery scheme. I deny all of it." Silas stepped forward, slow. "Then maybe the sheriff can help us understand. Sheriff Mercer, where is my original deed? Where's the county file on lot 22? Mercer paled. I don't know. It must have been buried," the judge finished. "Or perhaps removed intentionally." Mercer shifted in his seat. "I was just following orders." "Whose?" Rayner asked. Silence. The judge sat back. "I'll be issuing a warrant for Hank Dobbins. Sheriff Mercer, you are suspended effective immediately pending investigation." Gasps turned to murmurs. Dobbins looked ready to bolt, but the deputies flanked him fast. Silas exhaled, not in victory, but in relief. He'd brought the truth this far. As Dobbins was led away, Silas turned back toward the window. The sky outside had begun to clear, and in the distance the sun broke through, lighting the trail home. They caught Hank Dobbins half a mile outside town, heading west with a satchel full of cash and a stagecoach waiting at the canyon fork. He didn't get far. Deputies rode fast, silent, and surrounded him before his boots hit the step. When they shackled his hands, he still tried to smile, still tipped his hat like he was on the way to a business dinner, not a jail cell. But in Coyote Bend, that smile didn't mean much anymore. News spread like wildfire in dry brush. By noon, townsfolk gathered outside the sheriff's office, no longer whispering, but speaking plainly. They didn't just want answers. They wanted dignity returned. Old-timers who'd lost their ranches walked the streets again, pointing at maps, remembering markers, asking where their deeds had gone. For the first time in years, people weren't afraid to say they'd been wronged. Inside the courthouse, Judge Rayner signed a flurry of orders, one dismissing Mercer as sheriff effective immediately, the next appointed interim leadership until an election could be held, and the third, it began the process of reviewing every single land transfer tied to Hank Dobbins in the past 10 years. Silas stood in the hallway just outside the judge's chambers, hat in hand, as the news rolled in. "You did it, Hart," said Thatch, who'd been surprisingly sober for 3 days running. "Whole dang town's waking up, like somebody rang the church bell loud enough to shake 'em from sleep." Silas looked at the dusty sunlight pooling through the tall windows. "I didn't do it alone." Thatch grinned. "Still, folks needed someone to stand up when it wasn't easy. Most men wait till it's safe." Amos entered just then, cheeks flushed, badge on his chest. Not Mercer's badge, but a temporary one, borrowed from the supply box in the clerk's office. It looked too big for him, but it shone brighter than anything else in that building. "Judge asked if I'd serve till the election," Amos said shyly. "Told him I ain't no politician." Silas patted his shoulder. "That's exactly why you should." They stepped outside together, where the townspeople had gathered around the square. Some held old deeds in their hands, others just watched. There was a quiet reverence to it all, the same kind that falls over land after rain, not celebration, just breathing easier. Judge Rayner stood on the courthouse steps and raised a hand for silence. "Today," he said, "marks a turning point. We were blind, but thanks to one man's persistence and the bravery of those who stood with him, we've reopened 12 homestead claims, reinstated 3 settler properties, and are launching an investigation into the fraudulent actions committed under the color of law. This town owes a debt, not just to Mr. Hart, but to the truth." A round of soft clapping rose, joined slowly by louder cheers. Silas tipped his hat but didn't step forward. He wasn't built for attention. Later that day, while the sun slipped low behind the ridge, Thatch rode out to the edge of Silas's land with him. They stopped at the gate, now fixed, posts upright, wire stretched tight and true. "You really staying on?" Thatch asked, kicking a rock with his boot. "Land's mine again," Silas said, quiet but sure. "Figure I'll help the judge oversee the redistribution for the rest. Can't just fix my fence and ignore the rest of the damage." Thatch nodded. "Never figured you for a government man." "I ain't. I'm just a cowboy who remembers who built this place." As they turned back toward the cabin, a breeze carried the smell of mesquite and dust and a hint of something new. peace. That evening, as Silas swept the porch free of ash and memory, a girl from the general store rode up and set a warm pie on his step. "Figured you earned something sweet," she said with a smile, and for the first time in years, Silas didn't look away. The rain came soft and steady that night, soaking into the thirsty soil like an old promise finally kept. By morning, puddles shone in the ruts that once carried Dobbin's stolen trail, and the scorched patch where Silas's barn once stood was dark with rebirth. Steam curled from the earth as the sun broke through the clouds, warm and forgiving. Silas Hart stepped onto his porch with a mug of coffee and a long breath. It smelled like wet cedar and damp wheat, like home. Across the pasture, a line of townsfolk had come to help rebuild. Thatch arrived early with a borrowed wagon of lumber, whistling off-key and wearing a pair of boots that didn't match. 2 teenage boys from the church hauled up new shingles. Even Mrs. Cartwright, who hadn't spoken a kind word in a decade, brought a pan of cornbread and muttered, "Figure you'll need feedin' if you're gonna swing that hammer." Silas worked alongside them all. They raised new beams where the barn had fallen, set fence posts in straight lines, and laughed more than they spoke. He moved slower than he once had, but his hands remembered every nail, every groove in the wood Mary had touched. When he saw her old branding iron hanging in the rafters, miraculously spared in the fire, he took it down and set it by the hearth. Not for use, just for memory. Around noon, Thatch walked up, wiping sweat from his brow with a kerchief that used to be red. "Got a surprise for you," he said, grinning like a boy with a slingshot. He stepped aside, revealing a wooden sign, freshly carved. Silas read it aloud, voice catching just slightly. "Hart Ranch, Est, 1871. Reborn, 1891. He nodded once. "That'll do." By late afternoon, the barn stood whole again. The new roof gleamed under the sun, still wet from the morning's rain. It wasn't the same as before. Some things never are. But it was solid, honest, and earned. Amos rode out just before dusk, his badge still temporary but polished bright. "Judge Rayner finalized the reinstatements," he said, swinging down from his horse. 12 families get their land back, yours included. It's official, legal, sealed. Silas shook his hand. "You did good, son. I just delivered the papers. You delivered justice. Don't let anyone talk you out of that." They stood quiet for a beat, watching a hawk ride the wind over the distant ridge. Amos cleared his throat. "You know, folks keep asking if you'll run for office, land commissioner or something. You thinking on it?" Silas smiled, slow and amused. "I think I've had my fill of courthouses." "Fair enough." Amos nodded, then tipped his hat. "But if you change your mind, this town listens to you now." As the deputy rode off, Silas returned to the porch. The evening air was warm, the kind that holds on to summer even as the year starts turning. He settled into Mary's old rocking chair, the one she used to sit in after supper, humming soft songs only he ever heard. A soft clatter on the steps drew his eye. The girl from the general store, he'd seen her at the Jubilee, and again the day the news broke, set another pie down, this one peach. Her cheeks pinked as she smiled. "I figured rebuilding takes more than wood. Thought you could use something sweet." Silas stood. "That's kind of you." She shrugged. "You remind folks that land means more than dollars. Some of us needed to see that." He nodded, watching her disappear down the trail as the last of the light faded. The ranch behind him breathed with new life. The land was his again, not just on paper, but in truth. It had been tested, broken, nearly buried, but like him, it knew how to rise. If you believe truth still matters in dusty places, and that quiet strength still wins the day, saddle up and hit that subscribe button. Share this with someone who still carries a little cowboy in their soul.